Historical Society, and it's a special honor to speak in such a wonderful setting. What I want to do today is relatively briefly spend some time talking about the very early development of natural gas in this village. And it's not so much that it was natural gas, it was my interest in this is because of the level of scientific thinking. This is like a normal lecture hall again. The level of scientific thinking exhibited by some of the people involved in all this. And in order to do this, though, I've got to do a little bit of geology. I am a geologist and I do teach geology, so I need to spend some time, a short time, explaining to you why it is that the rocks beneath us, especially these shales that you can see wonderfully exposed down along the lakeshore in Dunkirk, became the rocks they are, the rocks that hold natural gas in them. And so I need to spend a little bit of time developing that, and I'll do that about halfway through it. But let's start with the beginning. We're all somewhat familiar with the history of Titusville. A 90-minute ride down to Titusville, and where allegedly the oil industry began. We're all aware of Edwin Drake. August 15, 1859, that's Drake right there at his well. That came in just about as he was to run out of funding. He was given a day or two to finish this up from the money holders in New York City, and then he was going to have to end it, and he hit it down there. And you've probably seen images like this of the Titusville area. They just went nuts down there and drilled on every available spot that they could. What's interesting, if you go down there, and it's really worth the drive down there. It's a great place. They have a wonderful museum down there. You can walk through the woods and probably go not more than 20 feet with encountering some of the hardware that was left there after this all ended. And it ended quickly. They just drew down that field very, very fast, and they left as fast as they came in. And again, another view of that area. It's completely grown over. Nature reclaimed the region. The people at Titusville, though, are going to get a little bit of debate from the Azerbaijanis, who believe they were the first in the mid-1840s to drill the first mechanical well in the Caspian Sea. And this is the Baku area of Azerbaijan in a period photograph. And this is what it looks like now. It's a major field in geopolitical terms. There's a lot of movement of nations to get close to this Caspian Sea area. The Chinese are becoming involved. We're involved. Russia's involved. And this is an area that's going to be receiving an awful lot of attention over the coming decades. Now, I've always looked at the formation of the drilling, the natural gas industry in two phases in Fredonia. And the first started out with William Hart. William Hart was a gunsmith, and he was a businessman, and I'm firmly convinced that William Hart was interested in making money. He was interested in using natural gas. There are a number of stories that it was all by accident. I don't believe it was by accident. Hart was a smart man, and he knew that natural gas could be used for illumination. And I think he had a business plan in all of this, and we all know his story. Get some idea of where it was. This is the rock downtown. I can't tell you how many times I've taken a picture of that. People ask me why I was taking a picture of that rock. It is a big part of our history in this town, and it's often overlooked. It's been moved a little bit from where it was originally set up. The initial well was drilled someplace in that area, I believe on the northwestern side of the bridge. This is the bridge over Canada Creek. There were a number of mills in that area. It was a low-lying area. Can't find any evidence of where it was actually drilled. That creek has changed location over 100 years a number of times, so it's very difficult to find out where it actually occurred. There's the view today. Our thinking is that it's someplace on the northeast shoreline, someplace up there, but I don't think we'll ever find. There's been some concrete abutments put in there to control flooding and that sort of thing, and so I'm certain that the creek has changed course over the time. But this is where it started. And there's virtually no photographic record of Hart's well, but this is a picture taken of it around 1850. This is probably where Dr. Twitchell's office is right now. And it's not what people think of as a well. It was actually what they call a cistern. They dug a hole and then kicked down, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, the well from within that hole. the goal was to collect gas in this container so that you could build up a little bit of pressure and feed it out on pipes to where it should go. This gas isn't pressured. It was down around 26 feet. It was definitely interacting with the water table as it rained. I suspect there wasn't a really strong flow. It may have been, appears to have been enough to generate some illumination in some houses and some of the mills down in that area, but the gas was not flowing with great pressure. Too much fluctuating of a water table seasonally, as well as as a consequence of the occasional rainstorms. There's a close-up of it. You get a sense that they laid rocks over the top of it, over this hole, this cistern, and that's where the conduits would come out and send gas to a number of locations down there for illumination. And one of the places that was illuminated apparently was the Lester House. This is pretty much where the fire hall is today. There are a number of mills in that area. Again, I don't want to leave you with the idea that there was a booming illumination. It was a very slow flow out of the ground. You want gas to come up under pressure, and this definitely was not a pressured flow. One of the questions has been, when was the well drilled? Because depending upon whom you read, you can see that the accepted date is 1821. And this is taken out pretty out along Main Street, right outside of where the museum is now, and you know, that's a date that has been with us for a long time. Problem is that over decades, the real story has changed a bit, and I think the first hint as to when it occurs is looking closely at the plaque on the rock. And what's important about this is that 1825 date. Now, I think what they were doing, and this was set up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and it was dedicated on this date in June of 1924. So it was the 100-year anniversary of the placement. And I think what they were doing, I think they had the year right, for reasons I'll get into. I think they had it was too early in the summer, but I believe what they were doing was conflating the drilling of the gas well with General Lafayette's visit to the town. And I believe the gas well was drilled later that summer after Lafayette had visited. And the reason for believing that is the Fredonia censer. You can read stories in the censer as it's actually happening. They are reporting it as a primary source. And I haven't done, I've got to admit that my wife is the person who's done the research. She's spent the time sitting in front of the microfilm and microfiche machines doing this. I'm the geologist, she's more the historian. But the Fredonia censer for a period of time was reporting this as it was happening. It's a primary source. And so I believe that Lafayette clearly came through, and a lot of what you read was that when he came through, the town was lit up by bonfires. But I don't think that it was natural gas. In fact, I know the wells were being drilled into August, and the hope expressed in one of the censer articles was that the town would be illuminated for Christmas. So, in any event, history changes ideas over time. Ideas and stories change, and I think that that's where the 1825 date came from. But again, it is well before Titusville, and we should realize that. There's an image from actually June 4th, 1925, of the celebration. The rock, the monument is at that location. There's a mill adjacent to it. So it was a major event on the streets of Fredonia at that time. They were celebrating, and there it is. Here's the fence that was adjacent to the creek. So when I moved here in whenever it was, 1981, that's where the rock was. It was up against the fence, or up against the edge of the creek. It's since been moved a little bit off to the right as you look at it. But that's the location. All right, so how did Hart know where to drill? Not too tough to do. Children, if you read some of the early history, Native Americans as well as for children in Fredonia were doing something called lighting the creek. They were setting up these little piles of wood over natural gas flows. Natural gas comes out in the water around here. You can see it bubbling. There are times when we're doing field work in these creeks, and we've walked every creek in western New York over the last 15 years, where you get a feeling that if you light a match, the whole area is going to go up. It can come out with quite a force depending upon the water table. This is an example of what you can do to it. That's natural gas seeping out at the Earth's surface and some of the fractures in the rocks themselves. And people have known about that. So if you're going to try to tap natural gas, if you're going to try to do some production from the rocks themselves, it seems logical that that's where you're going to go. And that's essentially what governed Hart and ultimately Preston Barmore to their locations. So where's the source of the gas that was tapped in Canadaway Creek here? It's this unit. This is a unit called the Dunkirk Shale, and that's an exposure down on the beach. Very easily accessible. A wonderful exposure. These are world-class exposures of fractured black shales. I take at least 2 field trip groups of people through this area every year showing them this. I've had groups from Columbia, from Calgary, a number of other places within the country, giving them a chance to see what these organic rich shales look like at the surface. Fantastic exposures. And that back there, that staining on the rock, is evidence that natural gas is seeping out along there. It's seeping out all the way along that interval along there. This is produced by algae that thrive on methane being attracted to that location of the rock. So it's quite common to see this around here, and these early explorationists were taken in by this. They saw it. They knew that this is where they ought to be looking. This rock, by the way, is probably about, these rocks you're looking at, probably about 50 feet below the rocks exposed in the creek down here. So it's beneath them. They drilled down about 26 feet, and they were catching some of the natural gas coming out of that. That's called the Dunkirk Shale, and I maintain that is the first natural gas source rock, commercial natural gas source rock in the country, perhaps the world. Now, why here? Why did rocks like the Dunkirk Shale and these others that you hear about, the Marcellus and the Rhine Street Black Shale, why did they accumulate here at this time? The Devonian period, which is the age of the rocks that are exposed around here, was a very different world. And what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what that world was like in this area. And hopefully that will give you some reason as to why these rocks accumulated. It's an interesting link between climate and the accumulation of rocks that will someday become source rocks. So, the rocks you're looking at here are about 375 million years old. We know that from contained fossils and some other ways of determining the ages of rocks. The world looked a lot different back then. This is a plate tectonic reconstruction of the world about 375 million years ago. Here we are. You can see, if you look closely, you can see the outline of the states. There wasn't much exposed in this part of the world. That's exposed rock, but there were shallow seas. There's the equator at that time. We were about 30 degrees below the equator in the southern hemisphere. It was a subtropical climate. You can see that there wasn't much of an Atlantic Ocean. In fact, it was a relatively thin seaway that separated what would become North America from something called Gondwana, which was a supercontinent that was comprised of a lot of the southern hemisphere continents. Now, Africa was part of it, South America, Antarctica, India, and a number of other lesser continents. And it was getting close to us. So this ocean was diminishing in time. So, first of all, there's the Dunkirk Basin. That's where the Dunkirk would accumulate. It was a basin from New York down into West Virginia in that area. It was a relatively narrow, relatively shallow ocean. It was a subtropical climate, but exactly how warm it was, it will probably surprise you. Now, I always worry about when I put things like this up, but it's a relatively simple plot. This is time. And this RCO2 is calculated that way. It's the Paleo CO2. Now, CO2 is the big greenhouse gas. The more CO2 you have in the atmosphere, more likely you're going to be warmer. So this y-axis is calculated by the assumed CO2 at a point in our geological history compared to the present CO2. And so, modern atmosphere has a value of 1. The CO2 now is equal to the present, so one number by its equal is 1. So everything on this diagram should be compared to that red line. And you can see, here we are, and there it is. What was the CO2 like back in the Devonian? As much as 10 times the CO2 in the atmosphere that we have now. Our atmospheric CO2, which is higher right now than it has been for 500,000 years is around 390 parts per million. That has a lot of people very concerned, and rightfully so. But back in the Devonian time, it was perhaps close to 4,000 parts per million. It was lethally hot. In fact, there's a lot of debate among various aspects of the geological community as to whether or not it was lethally hot in some parts of the world. It was a much different time. There was very little. One of the reasons that the CO2 was dropping through this time is that trees were finally coming on the scene. And trees take in CO2, and that was a natural way of bringing down CO2. But it was hot. It was really hot. Now, how would that affect the formation of source rocks? Well, one of the things that warmth does is it heats the ocean. And what happens is you get a very warm layer of water floating over that colder water. So any oxygen that's up here in the atmosphere, and there was oxygen, isn't going to be able to get down below. Because this warm water is lighter, it's floating on the colder water, nothing can get down there. And what you create then is an ocean that is layered, warm water on the top, cooler water on the bottom, and quickly that water down there runs out of oxygen. And so we know that at this time in our history there was a lot of marine life living in the water. They liked the warm conditions, it was subtropical, it was wonderful if you were something that looked like this. Plankton, microscopic life. But where you have a lot of things living, you have a lot of those same things dying. So the remains of these organisms would begin to settle to the bottom of the ocean. There's no oxygen down there. So what happens is they just accumulate in a muck of organic remains at the bottom of the sea. No oxygen down there, nothing could live there, just black clay and mud accumulating in this ocean, and nothing to burn it up, nothing to oxidize it. These are some remains of some of these plankton from the Devonian. This is taken with a scanning electron microscope that we use to do a lot of this work. By the way, a micrometer is a millionth of a meter, about a millionth of a yard. So you can really focus in on some really small things using it. And this is the remains of some of this plankton that lived during Devonian, settled to the bottom of the sea, and just became black mud sitting down there about 100 meters down. It was a completely different a climate that we can't even begin to understand. So the plankton settles down to the bottom, and it accumulates, and that's where the black shale that we see originates. And the interesting thing, it's kind of ironic in that warm climates favor the accumulation of organic remains. Warm climates favor the formation of the rocks that many people believe are helping to warm our climate again. It's all part of this carbon cycling on the Earth's surface. It's a very intriguing aspect of this that I spend an awful lot of, maybe too much time thinking about. But that's what happened. So it was partly the result of our climate at this time. It was a very rough climate. The second aspect that we've got to bring into this is plate tectonics. You've got Africa sitting out there, and it's moving like that, pretty quickly. Initially, Africa collided up in the New England area, and then as it came in, as you can see these arrows indicating that it sort of came in and rotated clockwise into the southern Appalachians. So it was kind of a two-hit event. First in New England, and then it slammed in down around Georgia and shoved an awful lot of rock up toward where we are. The byproduct of that was the building of this Appalachian mountain chain down through there. Now, one of the things that happens to these deposits in these small basins next to mountains is that they start to get buried. You're building these mountains up, and these mountains probably were in the range of approaching the Himalaya range at that time. They were very young mountains, and they were coming up very quickly, and they're shedding all kinds of debris into that basin. And quickly, those Devonian shales, the Dunkirk shale, starts to be buried very rapidly. And as it's buried, it's subjected to higher temperature. Just makes sense. The deeper you are in the earth, the hotter the rocks, the hotter your environment, and you begin to take that organic material and transform it. And when we reach about 3 kilometers, 90 degrees, a lot of people have this idea to generate hydrocarbons, you've got to be up at hundreds of degrees temperature. A warm cup of coffee, and you're in the range of generating oil. So we got up into that range, the rocks were buried around 3 kilometers, that's not really all that much. and this started to happen. Now, we've produced this in the lab, but we've also seen this. This is a picture of some Devonian sediments. This is what remains of an algae, some algae, and this thing migrating out is a crack that was produced by this algae becoming oil. And so what you're looking at there is a seam of oil leaving its ultimate source, the algae, and working its way into the rock. That's where it all begins. And that happens when you reach about 90 degrees centigrade, rocks start to transform and produce these microfractures. And again, the only way you're going to see this is by using a scanning electron microscope. We have access to one at the University of Buffalo. But the point is, the algae is transformed to oil. And ultimately, if we bury it even deeper, now the Dunkirk didn't get that deep, but we get down here and you start to produce natural gas. You're producing natural gas even with oil. So I suspect that some of the work we've done suggests that the Dunkirk got to right about here. It produced a lot of oil, and you might say, where's that oil? It went up the column, and it's the same oil that they've recovered from the Titusville area. So it's a major system out here in western New York. So 300 million years ago now, the Appalachian Mountains were forming, the ocean's gone. It wouldn't be until the Atlantic formed that another ocean. Africa or Gondwana had slammed into what was called Laurentia, North America. You had buried these organic rich rocks, they had generated hydrocarbons, and those are the same hydrocarbons that William Hart was bringing up to the ground in his well down here in Canada Way Creek. That's why we see, not only in western New York, but globally, that Devonian was a period of time when we have a lot of source rocks in various places, western Canada, South Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and a number of other places where we have rocks of that age generating these types of materials. So let's get back to Fredonia now. And here's, by 1850, Hart's well was beginning to fizzle. These wells don't produce for a long time. They eventually quickly exhaust themselves in natural gas, and the game's over. But luckily, along comes a young fellow named Preston Barmore. And really, all credit goes to Jim Bowles for finding this. I believe it was on eBay or someplace like that this image was preserved in a bidding match. Preston Barmore was an amazing guy. Not because he really pushed gas production in this town, but because of his level of scientific thinking. He was born in 1831, and he was educated right about where we are, in what had been here before, in the Fredonia Academy. This was a forerunner to SUNY Fredonia. I always take a little bit of pride in that Barmore got started in what would become SUNY Fredonia. So our Department of Geology has a link to him. One of the books he used, and I was able to find this out by looking at some of the records, is a very good textbook. It was The Elements of Geology, and he took geology. His academic record is there, so we have an idea of the courses he took. I have no doubt that he used an earlier version of this, and I suspect he became very interested in the geology of this area, but I cannot believe that he didn't know about this also. This is a volume that was published by a man named Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell is one of the is a giant in geology. He was one of he published, not this book, but some other books that are still being used. He was an amazing guy. He was a lawyer by trade, but he had a great interest in the earth, and he's a giant in geology. And he published his observations on a trip in the 1840s through the United States and other places. And he was also, by the way, a contemporary of Darwin. He was the guy who convinced Darwin to publish Origin of the Species. So this is from his diary on June 5th in 1841. Now Barmore was only 10 years old, but he would ultimately, I'm sure, be influenced by this. And I would draw your attention to a couple lines in there. He observed this. They were lighting the town, or parts of the town, with natural gas at this time. It was being received in something called a gasometer, which I believe was that cistern-like structure that was accumulating the gas, and from which they sent the gas to places like the Lester House. And he recognized that it was coming out of what he called black bituminous shale. That's the black shale. That's what we see down on the beach. I believe that Barmore, being the precocious guy he was, had to have read this. And he had to know that these are the things, these fractures, which are, this is from a picture taken right along Forest Place in Canaway Creek, of natural fractures in the shales. He knew the gas was coming out of there. There was a connection between the gas flowing and the cracks in the rock, and he would utilize that later on. Wonderful exposures. This is down in Black Creek. This almost doesn't even look natural with the degree these things are fractured. These are natural fractures. These are places where gas is coming out, and depending upon when you're down there, you can smell it coming out of there. This is on Canaway, but this is up on 18 Mile Creek where we were. That's a big crack in the rock. That's algae that loves methane. So we've got a microbiological region, or community in there of how methane flowing under natural conditions out to the Earth's surface affects certain biological niches. Even here, you can see, I suspect that if we could sample the water right along here and here in this creek, it would be devoid of oxygen. Because of these organisms that love methane and use up oxygen. So, Barmore knew this. He lived around here, and even at this case, I mean, this is natural fracturing produced in this rock, and when you get close up to it, you can even see some oil seeping out of this stuff. It doesn't go very far, and it doesn't go very fast. But Barmore made these observations early on. So Barmore also became interested in an 1835 report by the New York State Geological Survey. And what they recognized were a number of places close to Hart's 1825 well there, and the Risley buildings, which still stand, some of them. And not too far to the northwest was an area that the Geological Survey had recognized gas seeping from. So Barmore decided, I wanted to see what I could do with that. He was a relative of Hart's, and I know he had talked to Hart, and there was some connection to marriage also. And he became very interested in this location. He got some financial backing by a fellow named Elias Forbes of the town and some other people, and Barmore decided, let's drill some wells up there. This is another one of these places where we can't exactly find the site. That's a very flat area. Canaway Creek has done a lot of swinging around back and forth as a result of flooding. We do have some very early maps that from which we can triangulate that well location, and someday we might get around to doing it to see exactly where in that meadow those wells were put down. But there's no sign of them any longer. So Barmore went to doing these, and it was around 1857. This is an amazing picture, because we believe that's Barmore in that picture, and I believe this was saved by the people in the museum, the historical society of the museum here. What they're doing is showing you how wells were drilled back then. They didn't have rotary drills. They did something called kicking it down. And you can see this fellow has got his foot in a stirrup there, and the actual tool is attached to that cable. And what you do, this is a better view, is you jump on that stirrup. That drives that pole down with the tool at the end. It bounces back up. Ideally, you want some green wood to do this. So you jump on it. It drives the tool down into the rock. It bounces back up once you get off it and drives it down again, and maybe a second time. So you're spending the better time of your day jumping up and down on that stirrup. It's very physical. If you want to take a shot at it sometime, go on down to Titusville. They've got one set up, and you can try it yourself. Do it for about 5 minutes, and you'll have given yourself a pretty good workout for that day. But that's how they did it then. It was a lot of work. It was time-consuming. You had to be dragging out the chips of rock that were generated. But Barmore did it with the help of these other people, and he drilled down about 122 feet. And he produced a duster. It wasn't good. There was no gas in it. And he put a lot of time and spent a lot of money in this, and he wanted to recoup something. So Barmore went back to something he observed. Natural gas comes out of fractures. His thinking was that he, in his way to go down into the rock, had not encountered a fracture. Because if he had, he'd be getting natural gas out of it. So his thinking was, I'm going to make some fractures in the rock. I'm going to induce fractures in the rock. And he did that. He got, I believe, a 2-inch piece of iron, a little rod of iron, and heated it up, red hot. Before he did that, he dropped 8 pounds of gunpowder into the hole. Dropped the rod down into it, and you could guess what happened. He got a big explosion down in that hole. It blew out water, it blew out a lot of rock, but he got an unbelievable flow of gas. I maintain that that is the first recorded fracture stimulation of a well. The goal was to create conditions he observed. It was all empirical. He saw gas coming out of the ground in the creeks. He had to make fractures in the rock. He knew that's the only way the gas is going to come out. Go down to the beach sometime, take a small piece of shale and break it open, and take a whiff. It's in there. It just doesn't flow out. The rock is unbelievably tight. It will never flow out of the rock under natural conditions. He knew that. To my mind, that is more important than actually getting the gas out. He was thinking scientifically, and I admire scientific thinking in anybody. I really do. But he wasn't finished. Where's the gas coming from? Is it a deep source or is it a shallow source? In other words, he's asking, do we have to keep pounding down these wells 120 feet, or can we come back up, maybe 50 feet? Less work, get the same results. So he did something, he did the same thing. He lowered a bag of gunpowder down about 50 feet, or 60, somewhere in that range, maybe 80. Dropped that rod down and got another explosion. This time the hole collapsed in and sealed everything off, and he had a really rough situation. But again, it's a level of thinking that had not been illustrated by anybody. Not even the people drilling down in Titusville leave any recorded indication that they were thinking about the science behind all this. And now we know that there are deep oil, deep gas sources, shallow sources. It's all known nowadays. He was thinking along those. He tried to get it at about 80 feet. It's what we call a staged fracture stimulation. You try to do it at different locations. Again, a level of scientific thinking that I think is just amazing. He's an unbelievably bright fellow. Next thing he did was, once he was able to get everything going, he knew that he had to collect the gas in a central location. That's what remained of his gasometer. This is what it looked like before January 1964. He brought the gas in lead pipes, put down about 3 feet in the ground along the streets of Fredonia. He shipped it up here. This is probably around the area of the phone company parking lot. It eventually became a village garage or something like that later on. But that's not all that long ago. That was his gasometer, and it was from there he sent the gas to a number of places in the town and to the street lights. He was very interested not only in getting the gas, knowing why it's there, but he was also interested in distributing it. That's what it looked like after a snowstorm in January 1964. So that's all we have left of it. But it's a great story. These are some of the pipes that he used. The museum in town here still has some of this remains. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some out there yet. Somebody's doing some excavation someplace around here, brings up some of this stuff. I really wouldn't be surprised at all. Some more of the hardware that was used by Barmore. So Barmore wanted to make money, put a lot into this, so let's see if we can make money. And as far as I know, the first metered use of natural gas in the country, perhaps the world, was the Trinity Episcopal Church. And the record we have is from December 1858. By the way, I didn't stress that this is all happening before August 1859. Why August 1859? That's when the Titusville well comes in. This is going on before, probably before Colonel Titus, before they're drilling down there. And what was the rate? $4 a thousand cubic feet. They were actually using the metric that's used today to charge for natural gas. I believe today's natural gas is what, I don't know, between $2 and $3 a thousand cubic feet. Of course, we weren't using as much back then, but again, it's an amazing level of thinking, and this is what really piqued my interest in Barmore. Sadly, Barmore died in the early 1860s, and nobody's quite sure why. He did go down and work in the Titusville region, in the he naturally took his engineering expertise and worked with it down there. In fact, he used natural gas that he was bringing out of the ground down there to power his equipment. Just amazing. He's not even adding anything to it. He's using what he's generating to run the equipment to bring more up. He's outstanding. I think he died in about 1862. So, he's not even 30. He's 31 years old. It's a sad end to it all. So I want to summarize what I think are the more really salient points of development of natural gas in Fredonia. It was the upstream and downstream side that started in Fredonia. The upstream, the term means understanding where the gas is, why it's there, and what we can do to get it out. Barmore was very interested in that, and that's where I think he made his big contribution. The downstream side, let's see if we can distribute it and make some money off it. He made the gasometer. He brought that gas up from north of the Risley buildings up to about where the phone company parking lot is and distributed it from there and metered it. Preston Marmore, the part that I'm especially proud of is a connection between Fredonia and his work. And I am maintaining, and I'm going to try to approach the Society of Petroleum Engineers at Barmore, get some recognition for what he did. I believe he is the first petroleum engineer. It wasn't haphazard with him. There's a reason he was doing it. It was grounded in science. It was grounded in an understanding of geology. And to me, that speaks more than anything else for him. And I'll end with that last point. That's I believe his contribution to all this is a scientific view to all this. Certainly, it wasn't as advanced as would 25 years later would see it, but for his time and working with what he could work with, it was a great advancement. Thank you. You might not recognize that's the rock on the side of one of the village trucks. And they've got a number of different versions of that, but that was the one I could get that day. So.
Does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Tim.
Yes. Is that a glacial erratic that plaque is attached to?
Good question, Tim. I've had Tim in lots of classes. And that is the best question I've gotten from Tim. It is. That's not black shale. That's not shale of any type. That's granite. And the closest place you can find granite is someplace a couple hundred kilometers north of us in Canada. So I have no doubts that what they did was they found, and it's a nice looking rock, found that rock in a creek, because you can find them out there, and just brought it up and put the plaque on it. That was a wise choice. Any other sedimentary rock, you know that, Tim, you took geology. They're not around all that long, right?
Yeah. Could you explain how, when drilling, you get down so many thousand feet and then you turn left or right, how that turn is affected?
They actually start that, they'll start turn maybe 200 meters above the target. And they're guiding that, and what they're doing is the front of the core is where there's a motor on that. So when they're going down, a rotary drill is as they're drilling down, is controlled from the platform. They've got the rotary machine up there and they're pushing it down. When they drill these horizontals, they have the actual equipment that guides it is at the head end of it. So they're watching that go down and they're controlling it from the underground. So when they start to make the turn, it's not happening up here. They can bring it down, and they're watching the rocks adjacent to them. The device has sensors on it that can determine properties of the rock as they're going down, and they know where they are. So that, say their target is down 7,000 feet. When they get down to about maybe 400 feet, they're going to start going off. It's a pretty slow turn. It's not a right-hand turn, as you would think. And then they'll just follow that along. And the goal then is to keep the lateral, which is horizontal part along the horizon. And that's the tricky part. You don't want to go up, you don't want to go down. You want to stay in a specific interval for whatever reason. And that's the really tricky part. About half the time, from what I've been able to read, they stay in it. And the other half, they're drifting up and down and losing money. But it's a completely different approach. It's all happening underground. Everything else is happening above ground.
Another question. That black shale in Dunkirk, was that a mile or two down at one time?
We did some modeling of that, and our belief, yeah, it was probably a mile and a half. It reached that depth perhaps 290 million years ago, somewhere in that range.
Brought it up, erosion?
Well, the actual collision to produce the mountains caused it to pop up. And over geologic time, it's been rising, and especially it's been rising quite rapidly since the last ice age. Remember, 20,000 years ago, we had almost a mile of ice on us here. And once you remove that ice, the Earth's surface responds by bouncing up. Not bouncing as fast as that, but coming back up. That's why we have these creek valleys around here. Because as the Earth has been popping up, the creeks have been cutting down. And we're still rising. Occasionally there's even an earthquake in this area. That's a consequence of that. So the rocks went down, they came back. That's how we're allowed to see them now. But yeah.
You explained how the Devonian period had a lot of organic matter in it. Is there any suggestion that at least in western New York, the Ordovician period would have had that type of organic content?
Can
you repeat the questions, please?
The question is, the Devonian was a period of time when you had a lot of organic matter accumulating in the oceans. There's an earlier period of time called the Ordovician. And there's some interest in a unit called the Utica Shale, which is a black shale of Ordovician age. That's several miles below us right here. And the Ordovician was also a warm period. Actually, it was warmer, it may have been warmer than the Devonian. The big difference during the Ordovician is that there were no plants. And so you had no organic material washing in from the land. And one of the things that trees and plants do is that they create soil. And soils can be loaded with nitrates, natural fertilizers. And when we started getting plants on land during the Devonian, all that soil would wash into the ocean and bring with it lots of nutrients. That also led to the great abundance of organic remains in the Devonian. So the Ordovician was a really different world. We've just started, I'm working with a grad student at UB on trying to understand the chemistry of the Ordovician ocean. And we're seeing a lot of differences in that between the Devonian. So there was organic material accumulating, but not like we see in the Devonian. And some of these rocks have at least a quarter of the rock is organic remains. Nothing like that in the Ordovician.
Was the gaslighting continue to be used in Fredonia all the way up into electricity, or did they make a transition over to oil like a lot of other communities?
Oil's easier to move. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why we did see gas take over and continue growing as it did. And these were shallow wells that they drilled, and at some point in time they realized this isn't going to do anything. That's why more than 90% of the wells in the county are what are called Medina wells. They are drilled down to a sandstone called the Medina sandstone. And I mean, they're in town here. You've got one right behind the White Inn. White Inn #1 is a Medina well. And you can generally do reasonably well with that. The shales have always been tough because they're so tight, and you don't want to, it's a tough thing to do, and it's expensive. So at some point in time, it just got easier to move oil around. And I think that the Rockefellers and their work down in the Titusville area had part to do that, and controlled the railroads, and that controlled the distribution of oil. They were running pipelines from there all the way down to southeastern Pennsylvania at that time. It's easier to move oil in railroad cars than natural gas can move now. At that time, it couldn't. Yeah.
Could you talk about the fracking process that was used previously in the Medina wells versus what's necessary now for the Marcellus?
The fracking, it's a different type of rock. And I don't do fracking. First of all, I'm not an engineer, and I know a little bit about it because I'm involved in studying these rocks, and some of what we do here is used. They use something called a slick water. And the term slick water comes from the necessity to actually put something down in there that will allow the water to rush down there with such great force. They are pumping water into that rock at a much higher pressure than they are in the Medina. The Medina is closer to the surface. We have a well on campus, Fredonia State College number 1, that's 2,000 feet down. Marcellus wells and any black shale wells much deeper than that. But in order to get that water down there with the pressures that they need, because you have to understand that what they're trying to do is overcome compressive stress. The deeper you go into the earth, the greater the compression. So you're down a mile, you've got to put water down there, and water is an incompressible material. That's why it's mostly water. It doesn't behave elastically by squeezing down. And so what they'll do is they'll put a small amount of a gel in there to basically smooth the bore, the hole, so that the water can go down with less friction and with greater force. And I think that the newer frac treatments have fewer chemicals in than the Medina fracs used. So it's an improvement in that sense. But it's a very different type of approach than has been used in the Medina. And that's really about all I know about that. I find the science behind all this stuff to be much more fascinating than a lot of that.